They didn't even close the door. That's the part I keep coming back to. After 22 years, after building their entire client infrastructure from a whiteboard sketch and a borrowed server rack in a converted storage room, the chairman of Callaway Meridian Group couldn't be bothered to close the door before telling me my services were no longer required. I could hear the receptionist out in the hall, her chair rolling, a coffee cup being set down. Normal sounds from a normal Tuesday morning while my career was being folded up and handed back to me like a wet umbrella. "We're moving in a different direction, Miles." That's what the chairman said. His name was Bernard Holloway, and he'd shaken my hand at every Christmas party for 2 decades, called me the backbone of this company at the last all hands, and now he was looking somewhere slightly to the left of my face. "The board feels it's time for fresh energy." Fresh energy. I was 53 years old. I had more energy in my left hand than his nephew had in his entire 29-year-old body. But I knew what fresh energy meant. I'd been watching it coming for 6 months, the way you watch a storm front build on the horizon and tell yourself it'll pass north. It didn't pass north. His nephew's name was Tanner. Tanner Holloway. He'd finished his MBA at a school I'd never heard of, spent 8 months at a consulting firm in Phoenix where by all accounts he mostly attended happy hours and updated his LinkedIn. And then, one morning, he showed up at our Houston office in a slim-fit suit with his uncle's last name on his badge and a title that should have taken 15 years to earn. Chief Operations Officer. My title. My office. My 31 client contracts, each one representing years of relationship building, late-night calls, handshakes in airport lounges, problems solved at hours when most people were asleep. "You'll receive a generous severance," Bernard said. He slid a folder across the desk. I didn't touch it. 6 months. Full benefits through the end of the year. We'd asked that you transition your client files to Tanner over the next 2 weeks. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the night in 2009 when our largest pharmaceutical client nearly walked because of a data breach that wasn't even our fault. I thought about how I'd driven to their CEO's home on a Saturday, sat at his kitchen table, and spent 4 hours rebuilding trust from scratch. I thought about the Meridian contract we won in 2014 that essentially doubled the company's revenue, which I'd negotiated alone over 9 months because Bernard was recovering from his second hip surgery and nobody else knew the account well enough to handle it. I thought about my daughter, Sophie, the recitals I'd missed, the school play where she'd had the lead and I'd watched the first act from the back of the auditorium before slipping out to take a call from a client in Singapore. She was 20 now. She'd stopped expecting me at things somewhere around 14, which is a sentence I've never said out loud before and I'm not sure I can fully look at even now. "I'll need to review the severance terms," I said. My voice was completely level. I was surprised by that. Bernard nodded like that was reasonable, which it was, and stood up, which meant I was supposed to stand up too. I did. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was the same as always. Firm. Practiced. The grip of a man who'd learned early that confidence is performed before it's felt. I walked back to my office. My actual office for 2 more weeks with my name on the placard and my daughter's photo on the desk, and 22 years of institutional knowledge sitting inside my skull where nobody could touch it yet. I sat down. I didn't open a severance folder. I opened my email instead, and I read back through a chain from 8 months ago, messages between me and our legal team about a clause I'd quietly had inserted into my employment contract during the 2019 renewal. The clause wasn't complicated. It wasn't dramatic. It was 4 sentences that said, in essence, that all strategic client relationships I had personally originated and maintained, documented by signed client acknowledgement letters, which I had collected methodically over the years, required my explicit written authorization to transfer to any third party in the event of my involuntary termination, not the company's authorization, mine. 31 contracts. Combined annual contract value, $890 million. I closed my email. I picked up my daughter's photo. I set it back down. Then I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling and thought, for the first time in a very long time, about what I actually wanted. The 2 weeks of transition were almost peaceful. Tanner came by my office on the first day with a legal pad, and what I recognized as a rehearsed expression of collegial respect. He was taller than I expected. Good-looking in the way that reads as competent from a distance. He sat across from me and asked thoughtful questions and wrote things down and nodded at the right moments, and I thought, he's not a bad kid. That's the thing nobody tells you about these situations. The person replacing you is rarely a monster. They're just someone standing in a doorway that someone else opened. I answered his questions honestly. I showed him the CRM system, the filing structure, the communication protocols. I walked him through 12 of the 31 accounts in reasonable detail. The 12 that were straightforward enough that my authorization clause wouldn't matter much either way. The other 19 I described in general terms. Accurate general terms. Nothing false. Nothing that would later look like sabotage. Just incomplete. The way a map is technically accurate when it shows you the roads but leaves out the fact that 3 of them flood every spring. On the last day, I packed my personal items into a single box. The photo of Sophie, a coffee mug she'd given me that said, "World's okayest dad," a joke that landed differently now than it had when she was 15 and thought irony was the highest form of love. A small wooden thing my ex-wife had given me our first Christmas together, before everything. I didn't know why I still had it, and I put it in the box anyway. Bernard stopped by to say goodbye. He was gracious about it. He said the word legacy twice and meant it neither time. I thanked him and meant that neither time either. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called my attorney. The authorization clause had been drafted carefully enough that it required a 30-day notice period before any client relationship could formally transfer. Notice that had to come from me, in writing, to each client individually. If no notice was provided, the relationships were considered suspended in legal ambiguity, which meant Callaway Meridian Group could not enter into new or renewed agreements with those clients without exposing themselves to significant contractual liability. 19 clients. Combined, $640 million in annual contracts, most of them mid-cycle, all of them up for renewal within the next 18 months. My attorney sent the initial notice letters to the clients on a Thursday, not to Callaway Meridian, to the clients themselves, politely worded, professionally structured, informing them that there was a contractual question regarding the continuity of their account management and that they might wish to pause any renewal discussions until the matter was resolved. 6 of them called me directly within 48 hours. These were clients I'd known for years, people who had my cell number not because it was in any company directory but because I'd given it to them personally, because at some point there had been a crisis and I had answered and the problem had gotten solved. And after that, you don't go back to calling the main line. The CFO of one of our pharmaceutical accounts called on Friday afternoon. I'd worked with her for 11 years. She'd sent flowers when my mother passed. "Miles," she said, "what is happening over there?" I explained the situation as neutrally as I could. There was a contractual question regarding my departure. Her company's account was among those affected. I wasn't in a position to advise her on what to do, but I wanted her to be aware. There was a pause. "They replaced you with the owner's nephew," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's correct." Another pause. "How long have you been planning this?" "I've had the clause in my contract for 4 years," I said. "I hoped I'd never need it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'm going to need to speak with our legal team," she said. "But Miles, off the record, I want you to know that this account follows you, wherever you land." I thanked her. I meant it. By the end of the second week, 9 clients had formally notified Callaway Meridian that they were pausing renewal discussions pending resolution of the contractual situation. 2 had already begun exploratory conversations with a small advisory firm a former colleague of mine ran in Dallas. The firm's name was Crossfield Partners. My name was not yet on the door. But we'd been talking. I found out about Bernard's reaction secondhand, from a former colleague who still had friends in the building. Apparently, he didn't believe it at first. Tanner had gone to him with the attorney letters, and Bernard had looked at them and said something to the effect that this was a bluff, that no employee had that kind of leverage in a contract, that their legal department would handle it in a week. Their legal department looked at the contract and reportedly did not handle it in a week. What followed, from what I heard, was a fairly compressed sequence of events. The general counsel requested an emergency call with my attorney. My attorney was professionally pleasant and explained the clause in straightforward terms. The general counsel asked whether I would be willing to negotiate. My attorney said he would convey the question. I was willing to negotiate. I have always been a reasonable person. I said I would authorize the transfer of all 31 client relationships in full, with complete documentation and my personal introduction to Tana on every account, in exchange for 3 things. A revised severance of 18 months instead of 6, a formal written acknowledgement of my contributions to the company over 22 years, and 1 additional item that had nothing to do with money. The 18 months they agreed to in about 4 hours. The written acknowledgement took 2 days of back and forth and was ultimately a paragraph, signed by Bernard, that said what any decent person should have said in that first meeting instead of looking slightly to the left of my face. The 3rd item took longer because nobody understood it at first. I asked that the company donate $50,000 to the Houston Food Bank in my name. Bernard, from what I heard, stared at that request for a full minute before signing off on it. I think he was trying to find the angle. There wasn't one. My mother had volunteered there for 12 years before her health made it impossible. I'd been meaning to make that donation for 3 years and kept putting it off. It seemed like a reasonable time to stop putting things off. I want to tell you about the moment I realized something had shifted inside me. Because it didn't happen when the settlement was signed. It didn't happen when the first Crossfield Partners contract came through, or when the pharmaceutical CFO officially moved her account, or when I got the office in the Galleria district with the windows that look south toward the medical center. It happened on a Saturday morning about 6 weeks after I left Callaway Meridian. Sophie called. She didn't call often, not because of any rupture, but because we'd both quietly accepted a certain distance, the way you accept a room temperature that isn't quite comfortable enough to complain about. She called to tell me she was switching her major from business to environmental science, and she wasn't sure how I'd react. I asked her to tell me about it. She talked for 40 minutes. I sat on my back porch in the November light and listened to my daughter talk about hydrology and watershed management and a professor who'd changed the way she understood systems, and I didn't check my email once. When she finished, she said, "I thought you'd be disappointed." "Why would I be disappointed?" I asked. "Because you always said," she stopped. Started again. "You used to talk a lot about being practical, choosing things for stability." I thought about the storage room where I'd built my first server rack. I thought about the Saturday morning I'd driven to a stranger's kitchen table to save a contract. I thought about 22 years of choosing stability and what stability had eventually chosen to do with me. "Sophie," I said, "I spent 2 decades being very practical and I ended up losing the thing I built anyway. The person who has my old job is 29 years old and doesn't know the difference between a client relationship and the client file. Study whatever tells you something true about the world." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she said. Like actually, I looked out at the yard. There were leaves down from the live oak. I'd been meaning to rake them for 3 weeks. "I think I'm getting there," I said. Crossfield Partners has 11 employees now. When I joined as a partner, there were 3. We brought on 4 of the former Callaway Meridian accounts in the first 6 months. By the end of the year, we had 7. The pharmaceutical CFO became not just a client, but a genuine friend. We have dinner 2 or 3 times a year, and she is relentlessly honest with me in a way that I find I need more than I used to. I heard that Tanner lasted 14 months at Callaway Meridian before quietly transitioning to a strategic advisory role, which, in my experience, is what companies call it when someone isn't working out, but the family relationship makes a clean exit complicated. I don't know what he's doing now. I genuinely wish him something that leads him toward who he actually is, rather than who his uncle needed him to be. That's not sarcasm. It's just what I believe about people in his situation, which is that they rarely ask to be placed where they were placed. Bernard, I haven't spoken to since the settlement. I don't have feelings about that one way or the other. Some professional relationships are exactly what they appear to be, and what ours appeared to be was a transaction that lasted 22 years and ended when it stopped being convenient for one party. That's not tragedy. That's just clarity arriving late. What I do think about, more than I expected, is the younger version of myself. The one who drove to a stranger's house on a Saturday to save a contract. I used to think of that story as evidence of my value to the company. Now I think of it as evidence of a misalignment that took me 2 more decades to recognize that I was giving the best of myself to people who were keeping score in a different currency than I was. I'm not saying that to be bitter. I'm saying it because I think a lot of people listening to this know exactly what that feels like, and nobody tells you, while it's happening, that you get to renegotiate the terms, not with your employer, with yourself. Sophie came to Houston for Thanksgiving. She stayed 5 days, which was 4 more than usual. We raked the leaves from the live oak together on the second morning, which took longer than it should have because neither of us knew where I'd put the second rake, and we spent 20 minutes looking before finding it behind the water heater. She thought that was funnier than I did. We ate actual Thanksgiving dinner at the table, which was also unusual. Most years I'd been on a plane or wrapping something up at the office or simply too depleted to do more than ordering. I made the turkey. It was fine, not exceptional. Sophie made a sweet potato thing from a recipe she'd found, and it was genuinely excellent, which I told her, and she said her roommate had taught her, and then she talked about her roommate for a while and I listened. After dinner, we sat on the porch even though it was cold, because she wanted to see the stars, which you can barely see in Houston, but you can see a little if you go to the back of the yard away from the porch light. She asked me about my mother. I told her things I hadn't told her before, not because I'd been keeping them from her, but because she hadn't asked and I hadn't thought to offer. I didn't know you were that close to her, Sophie said. We didn't always show it well, I said. That's kind of a family pattern. She laughed, not unkindly. I noticed, she said. I said I was sorry. For the recitals and the school plays and the general accumulation of moments I'd traded for something that turned out to be less permanent than I'd believed. I didn't say it as a speech. I said it the way you say something when you've been carrying it long enough that it comes out quietly, almost like an exhale. She didn't say it was fine, which I respected. She said, I know you were trying, which is different and more honest, and, I think, the beginning of something rather than the end of it. We went back inside when our hands got too cold. I made coffee. She showed me a documentary about river systems on her laptop. I watched the whole thing. It was, without any exaggeration, one of the better evenings I've had in recent memory. If you've built something, really built something, with your time and your knowledge and the parts of yourself you don't get back, then you already know that the work doesn't disappear when you walk out the door. It lives in systems and relationships and the particular way certain problems get solved because of how you taught someone to think about them. Nobody can actually take that from you. What they can take is your access to it and your title and the office with the windows, and they can hand all of that to someone else. But they can't hand over the thing that made it work. I learned later than I'd like, that protecting your own work isn't cynicism. It isn't distrust. It's the same thing you do when you save your files in more than one place or back up the server before a major update. You do it not because you expect the worst, but because you are a professional, and professionals don't leave their most important assets unprotected. I learned late that the people who need you most will rarely be the ones who say so until you're already gone. I learned late, and I'm still learning, that the things you postpone long enough eventually make the decision for you. Sophie's finishing her junior year in May. She's doing a field study in Wyoming this summer, something involving snowmelt and aquifer monitoring. She's been sending me photos, ridge lines, equipment, the occasional muddy boot. I have them saved on my phone. I look at them more than I look at most things. I don't know that I've earned the right to be as proud as I feel, but I feel it anyway, and I've decided that's enough to start with. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I could. Not the 22 years ago version, that one was too green to listen. Maybe the version at 40, still running hard, still believing that if you gave enough of yourself to something, it would protect you in return. That version, I'd tell him, what you build and what you're owed for building it are two entirely separate conversations, and you have to be the one who shows up for the second one, because nobody else will. Bernard wasn't a villain. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who ran a company and made the kind of decision that men in his position make when they want to solve two problems at once: the nephew who needs a place and the veteran who's become expensive and comfortable and easy to underestimate. I was easy to underestimate. I'd let myself become that. When you solve enough problems quietly, people start to believe the problems were never that serious. That's not their failure of perception. That's mine, for never making the cost of the work visible. What I understand now, sitting on the other side of it, is that ethics isn't just about how you treat other people. It's also about how honest you're willing to be about the terms you've accepted and whether those terms are actually fair. I accepted terms for 2 decades that I never questioned. Not because they were good terms, but because I was too proud to seem like someone who needed to negotiate. That's not integrity. That's a kind of ego dressed up as professionalism, and it cost me in ways that don't show up on any balance sheet. The clause in my contract, the 4 sentences that changed everything, wasn't revenge. I want to be precise about that. I put it there 4 years before Bernard ever walked me to the door, not out of distrust, but out of a slow-growing awareness that I had never once protected the thing I'd spent my life building. Protecting your work isn't a cynical act. It's what any person with genuine self-respect does with something they've earned. Tanner could have the title. He could have the office and the placard and the annual reviews. He could not have 22 years of trust that people had extended specifically to me, not to the company, and not to him. What I didn't expect was Sophie. That's the part of this story I find myself returning to most. The Saturday she called about switching her major. The 5 days at Thanksgiving. The photos from Wyoming, muddy boots in the snow. I spent 22 years choosing the work over the person she was becoming, and then the work made that choice irrelevant in about 5 minutes. And what was left was a daughter who was still, somehow, despite everything, willing to let me show up differently. I don't think you earn that. I think you receive it if you're lucky and honest enough to recognize what it costs the other person to offer it. Sophie's resilience is hers, not mine. What I can do is not waste it this time. The hardest thing about getting something badly wrong for a long time is that you can't go back and unwrong it. You can only decide, at whatever point the clarity arrives, that you're going to carry the knowledge forward instead of sideways. That's what I mean by intelligence. Not cleverness, not strategy, not knowing how to protect yourself with 4 sentences in a contract. I mean the particular kind of awareness that looks at your own life without flinching and says, here is what I chose, here is what it cost, here is what I'm going to do now that I can see it clearly. That's also what I mean by resilience. Not surviving the thing that knocks you down, getting up and making the fall worth something. A lesson, a recalibration, a reason to rake the leaves and watch a documentary about rivers and answer the phone when your daughter calls. Bernard Holloway did me the favor of forcing a clarity I'd been avoiding for years. I wouldn't wish what happened on anyone, but I'm not sure I'd undo it either.